Вітаю в українському.
Greetings. Welcome to Ukraine Crisis Media Center. And considering the fact that today is almost 1 year anniversary since ratification of the agreement on the strategic cooperation between the Russian Federation and Northern Korea, we decided to organize the expert discussion on the development of the relations of Moscow and Pyongyang. And we're going to discuss the development of the image of the North Korea in Moscow landscape and aspects of military technical cooperation between Russia and the DPRK pose a threat to Ukraine and in the medium term, and how does Kremlin assess the potential for cooperation with North Korea and the implication of the Moscow-Pyongyang partnership for security in East Asia. Today we have with us Mykhailo, Samus, military political expert, director of the new Geopolitics Research Network platform, Natalia, Butyrska, associate senior analyst, Asia-Pacific expert at the New Europe Center, and Anton, Ganotsky, Asia-Pacific expert at the AdAstra think tank, and Butyrska, acting executive director, executive analyst of the Ilko Kuchik Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and I'm your moderator, Vladimir Solovyan, head of the Hybrid Threat Analysis Group. And let's start with a small presentation. With this, I would like to ask to show the presentation. And with this, I'd like to start with a short excursus in 2016 with the relations between Moscow and Pyongyang were on quite a low point when the UN sanctions were imposed for North Korea, and Moscow joined them. And according to these sanctions, in 2019, all the employees from North Korea had to be withdrawn, which were constructing their so that was the cooperation between the Pyongyang and Moscow, and this sector was developing the most efficiently. But despite this fact, the Russian Federation used the North Korean topic and the development of the nuclear and the rocket program, and that is the main reason why the sanctions were imposed in order to establish the informational provocations. And here we have the lesson. The lessons on how have the Western analysts, including Ukrainian analysts, have to be. We have some vast experience when communicating with Western experts, but we have to emphasize that we have to be careful when using the Russian sources, because, for example, in the framework of the research which was published in 2016, this research was conducted by the International Institute of Strategic Research, which is based in London. One of the authors of this research, Mykhailo, stated that it is possible that one of the components, one of the most important components for the rockets, there are 1014, was in the North Korean program from Ukraine, from Pivdenmarsh plant. And if we consider the research itself and the links, which go with the statement, and if we check the sources, we can see the statements of the Russian so-called military experts, the Russian websites, which interpreted in their own way theoretical cooperation of Ukraine with North Korean, which has never happened, in order to create misinformational piece of information. And now we can see that one of the people who were saying that is one of the rupers of Russian misinformation. So in fact, that is an example how Western analysts' mistake turned out to be a big problem, because he bought it. He bought Russian media, the Russian Federation used this case in order to say that Ukraine has something to do with North Korean rockets, and that created the scandal because these materials were published by the New York Times without critical consideration, and then the Russian Federation, in all possible ways, was distributing this information in order to discredit Ukraine. So I consider that these kind of cases are possible in the future as well, not only regarding North Korea, but the Russian Federation will try to do their best through the cooperation with the military industrial complex. It can be not just Middle East, but also Latin America and Africa, and that is one of the examples on how the Russian Federation works and why you have to be careful when working with Russian sources of information, because in fact this myth was debunked, but the informational loss has happened. So on this slide you can see how today Russian propaganda has changed the approach to North Korea. In previous years, we could have observed more cases when the cooperation with North Korea was ignored, and now North Korea is one of the important topics covered by media, and we can see that we have quite detailed movies filmed about this topic, and also there is the new project, the construction of the bridge between Moscow and Pyongyang, and you can see that this message is on Russia 24, and TASS is informing us that in North Korea, since the 4th year, students will study Russian. So we can see that there is a systematic approach to relations between North Korea and the Russian Federation, and they are trying to balance it with relation with the People's Republic of China, and they are trying to balance it the way how it was during the Cold War. And in fact, we can see some certain activity also on the Telegram, even though we have to say that the groups dedicated to the topic of North Korea on Russian Telegram, there are just a few of them, and they are not exceeding 1,000. Moreover, the Russian Federation is not concealing the fact that they are cooperating with North Korea. They are, recently, we saw few reports when Russians, together with North Korean soldiers, they are demining Kurska Oblast, and these reports are in media. And after Putin has admitted that North Korean troops are the part of the participated the Kursk battle, this narrative is quite openly shown in official media. But I'd like to say that before that there was quite an intensive period of awareness program to so-called independent YouTube channels, because North Korean situation was very interested for the broad audience. And for example, the interview of one of the leading leading experts in Korean studies, Mr. Lenkov. So that is one of the most famous videos on Dut's YouTube channel. A North Korean topic, for example, if we look on the second picture, that is the Ludim YouTube channel, Anton, the former military correspondent, is the owner of this channel, and he went to North Korea and he made a report, and more than 40 millions on YouTube. So we can see that this topic is becoming more interesting for the population of the Russian Federation. So we can see that some of these views were generated, but at the same time we can see that still it is very popular among the residents of the Russian Federation. And currently the Russian official propaganda kept this trend. Also, another topic which is interesting is tourism, Russian tourism in North Korea. And I think that first of all, it is interesting for North Korea because they can get some income and they are developing their capacity. Maybe soon we are going to discuss it, whether it is implemented in the way they planned and how Russians influence the development of the tourism in North Korea. But nevertheless, we are following North Korean propaganda, and even through federal media, we can see that the Russian Federation is popularizing this tourist destination, and some tour companies, tour agencies, which used to be quite marginalized, we can see that they are developing quite fast, and they have higher, more audience. So, for example, we can see that there are different formats. You can have the honeymoon tour to Pyongyang. You can have New Year party in Chucha style, or you can send your children to the summer camp in Pyongyang. Maybe for some of them that is the way to remember their Soviet past. And the last slide, which demonstrates cultural diplomacy, which is actively supported both from Moscow and Pyongyang. And one of the latest examples is the visit of the so-called famous singer in the Russian Federation, Shaman, which is a symbol of Putinism in Pyongyang. He was greeted very well, and in the Russian Federation we can see also the exhibitions dedicated to the development of North Korea, their culture, their social realism, which is quite popular among the majority of the Russians who are reflecting on the history of the Soviet Union. And we can see that even high representatives are participating these programs from the side of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, and the North Korean politicians are trying to promote their country. So that is what we observe in most of the agitation materials, which North Korea is trying to promote in Russian media field. So with this, I'd like to move to the discussion, and maybe one of the key and important topics for us is the conclusion. In the beginning, I mentioned that in November it will be 1 year since the strategic cooperation agreement was signed between Moscow and Pyongyang, and therefore I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Samus in order to discuss the results of the cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang, and whether we can be stating that on this stage the engagement of North Korea is not so relevant for the Russian Federation, considering the fact that they have exhausted most of the arsenals of North Korea, and whether we can say that the activization of cooperation with North Korea will happen as well as it happened during the Kursk operation, or what can we see in winter 2025-26? Thank you very much for the invitation. That is an honor, and that is always a great pleasure to participate in such events organized by Ukraine Crisis Media Center. And the topic is very relevant, even though it's somewhere not maybe the top priority for media, but we should not forget about it. And indeed, for more than 1 year, the Russian Federation is working with North Korea, and we can make some conclusions of what we were talking about this year and even early, because my personal assessment, the Russian Federation turned North Korea to its, so to say, military industrial factory plant, which thanks to Russian technologies, huge investments, which maybe North Korean regime has never seen before. And that's true because let's remember that during Soviet Union, North Korean regime did not get any kind of funds. Maybe on the first stages of its existence, but even in 1990s or even in 1980s, we couldn't say that the Russian Federation was supporting North Korea. And now the situation has drastically changed. North Korean regime received billions of dollars, which this regime is definitely investing not only in the social project, which they are sometimes showing to give an image that everything's fine here and we are living better and better. But at the same time, we understand that all these investment, thanks to Russian technologies, and what is more important, thanks to Chinese technologies, and also, so to say, the machinery and the resources is turned into the modern plants, which are producing not only which produces not only munition, because we are mainly talking about munition, because the Russian Federation without North Korea wouldn't have been able to organize the operation they had back in 2024. And since December 2023 until now, this big campaign continues, which the Russian Federation continues against Ukraine, offensive operation, and now trying to stop these offensive actions on the front line. We remember that North Korea is one of the main sources of this offensive potential, because they have not only munition, which without North Korea, the Russian Federation would not have been able to manage it. The Russian Federation would not have been able to use as much artillery as they are doing it now with North Korea, delivered from the stocks or produced in North Korea. But some experts say that exhaustion of the stocks in North Korea is not able to deliver the same number of munition they did in 2024, even though we can say that artillery is used less because the drone war means that artillery is not so important, or it is in another category, that is the long-range high precise weapon, and it works with drones, and it has an impact on the deep tactical level of operations. And now we can say that North Korean systems are not German systems, so to say, or that are the systems of 1950s, 60s, or maximum 70s of the 20th century. And therefore we can state that, in fact, the situation has changed. But at the same time, I would like to draw your attention to technological part. Not just the fact that the Russian Federation is using this cooperation with North Korea to enhance their own opportunities in the war with Ukraine. Another important thing here is that the ballistic missiles which shot Ukraine, Kain-23, which missed any target, at the moment they are not less efficient as Iskanders are. So there is a transfer of technologies which we can observe ourselves from the Russian Federation to North Korea, and North Korean industry, their technological level of ballistic missile production has increased. And our analytical center 1 year ago, and before that, was stating that, in fact, these transfer of knowledge will definitely be happening, and it is something that will definitely happen. And we are talking not about only ballistic missiles, but we are talking also about submarines. We are talking about the launchers for ballistic missiles that are the atomic submarines, which will be created together with the Russian. That is a transfers of technologies of all the rocket weapons. And after this cooperation, in fact, the impact will be not on Ukraine, but for the Asian and Pacific regions. So the impact of this cooperation might be even bigger for the alliance of the US rather than Ukraine, because Ukraine has their own alliance, and our technological level also grows, and we can be in the constant competition. But I cannot say that we are losing this battle. But speaking of the South Korea and Japan, and the interest of the US, I cannot say that they are really serious about it. And at the moment, we can say that during this period of time, they lost the time when they could have made a big pressure on the Russian Federation with sanctions, and also on North Korea, and also on China, frankly speaking. Without China, this process of transfer of North Korea to the military industrial plant of the Russian Federation, and therefore North Korean regime, was impossible, because without flow of Chinese currency, because how it is happening, the Russian Federation is selling oil to China with yuan, then it is invested in machinery from China, and then it is sent to North Korea with yuan, which they get for Russian oil, and the new plants are built, and the new munition is produced, and maybe ballistic missiles. So that is the loop. For some reason, our American partners or South Korean partners sometimes do not see that, and even though they agree that this fact can have place, they did not consider it to be a systematic problem. So I think that we have to research this issue, and we have to return to our American and South Korean partners, European partners, in order to establish systematic approach to this situation, to consider it not to be separate events, but we are talking about a systematic approach, and the sanctions have to be imposed against the Russian Federation, North Korea, and China, and we have to be frankly speaking about that. Thank you. Thank you. And considering the aspects which you've mentioned regarding the development of the military-industrial complex of North Korea, thanks to cooperation with the Russian Federation, namely the precision level, increasing precision level of North Korean missiles. And with this, I would like to ask the question: so, what kind of concerns this contact creates in Asia, namely South Korea? And here, I think that Natalia Butyrska could have commented on that, considering the fact that you have significant experience in communication with local expert community. In your opinion, considering your experience, do you think that the level of expectations and maybe some risk, some security risk, has increased after improving cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea among political elites, and maybe? And can Ukraine rely on activization of cooperation with South Korea in order to have some leverages there as well? Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you for the invitation. Unfortunately, North Korean supporting the Russian Federation is not a uniting factor between South Korea and Ukraine, despite the fact that South Korea has huge potential of military industrial complex which could have helped Ukraine to counter the Russian Federation. Together with North Korea, we did not get the military support, and in the future we most likely will not get it as well. The second thing is that it did not unite us in one, create the axis which will counter Moscow-Pyongyang axis. And inside Northern Korean, there are two opposite opinions on how to build their policy regarding North Korea, and therefore we can see regular when progressive political democratic party is the leading one, we can see that the relations between North and South Koreas are warming, and then the conservatives are coming back, and then we can see more acute phase. And the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine is in two phases. We can say even that there were different periods, because on the first stage in 2022, in the beginning of 2022, the democratic Moon Jae-in was ending his presidency, and he helped this meeting to happen between Trump and between North Korea and the U.S., and therefore he did not respond firmly. How can they be aligned with the Western partners regarding the sanctions? Because he didn't want to spoil the relations with the Russian Federation. And only under the pressure of the U.S., South Korea has to impose their own sanctions and limitations regarding technologies. But then Yoon Suk-yeol was in power, and in his external affairs, he was trying to change the focus of South Korea from South Korean peninsula, because unfortunately they are focused on the security issues only on Korean peninsula. And it's hard for them to accept, partially politically, partially socially. But Yoon Suk-yeol, he tried to overcome these limitations, and that was the reason why we had quite a good dialogue. You remember that he visited Ukraine, and he was very close to giving us the weapon, and he was trying to use the pressure on the Russian Federation, a kind of threat regarding the weapon, in order to make it infeasible for North Korea to cooperate with the Russian Federation, because for North Korea it is mainly the transfer of technologies, and they were trying to use this aspect. But unfortunately, in political circles, in oppositional ones, which had the majority in the parliament, they did not agree completely that South Korea has to have the proxy war in North Korea on the territory of Ukraine, and therefore Yoon Suk-yeol was not able to implement their big desire to give the weapons. And later you remember that we had there was martial law and then impeachment, and now we can see the representative of Democratic Political Party and the president Lee Jae-myung. He was the head of the opposition. He is absolutely against support of Ukraine, not only military but also financial, because quite often you could have heard that the funds which could have spent on the needs of the Korean society are given to Ukraine. He doesn't agree absolutely that that the previous president supported Ukraine, and he stated that he's going to recover the relations with the Russian Federation and China, because they have an impact on North Korea, and of course North Korea because they want to have some kind of trade relations, and they want to smooth this situation between North Korea and South Korea. And in this way, we can see that in South Korea, they're trying to return. At least they are trying not to take into account the fact that North Korea, before 2022 and after 2022, there are two different Koreas. And not just because in Kim Jong-un became more powerful, but because South Korea gets and will continue getting not only funds, but also the opportunity to modernize their military industrial complexes. And South Korean army, anyways, is participating in the war. North Korea is obtaining the experience, and therefore it creates absolutely different experiences. And personally, I observe that inside Korean society, of course, servicemen, they understand that the level of risk is raising, and they pushing their governments to get ready. But on the political level, we can see the situation when they are trying to show that the risks are lower. And finally, I would like to add one more comment regarding your presentation and regarding the factor that Ukraine has transferred the technologies to the North Korean. Well, that actually works well in South Korea. Among those part of the society and politicians who are against the support for Ukraine and who want to have better relations with the Russian Federation, because quite often in their press you can see the articles, especially in the press, which is supported by the Democratic political party. Why should we be supporting Ukraine? Why should we be giving a weapon to Ukraine if Ukrainian engineers were the ones who helped North Korean engineers to create a weapon against ICE? So why Ukrainian pilots were participating the war, and were in Kyiv, they have the museum where they are praising these pilots. And when Korean journalists are coming to Ukraine, they go to this military museum, they are taking a photo of it, and then you can see in press this fact, which is playing against us, because next to it we can see that the Russian Federation since 1990 cooperates with us quite closely, and our military complex inherited lots from the Russian Federation, and Ukraine did nothing for us, so we are not going to give them anything. So that is a general picture. Thank you very much for a very interesting analysis, and that is also an example of how we should be working with some societies in Eastern Asia, and not to we have to have more individual approach to understand what is more interesting for the audience in Japan, in South Korea, in China, because Ukraine can just turn a blind eye on what is happening in the media landscape of China. But I think that we will follow the general topic, and with these I'd like to return to the question which is relevant now when we see the activization of the negotiation process between the Russian Federation and the US. Moscow is flirting with the US, and we can see that it has an impact on the relations with Tehran and Pyongyang, and that is the axis of evil, which we can see in military and scientific cooperation, and it is prevailing over the political relations to get an agreement. So when we have the real perspective of the agreements on the level of the global states, Moscow, at this moment, for some reason, we understand actually why, starts to move away from the active positioning of the unions with other autocracies. And I think that everyone will agree that Iran is revising how efficient cooperation with Moscow was after the 12-day war. And if we return to North Korean example, we can see whether the cooperation will be relevant for the Russian Federation, because the main weapons is drones, and artillery is around 20%, and artillery is 20% from both sides, and that can be also the factor. We can add here the fact that North Korea is running out of the missiles during these last 1.5 years. So from the perspective of the current dynamics of the relations between the US and Moscow, we can forecast whether Moscow will return to the active promotion of the axis of evil. Tehran, Moscow, and Pyongyang, in the context of the attempts to get an agreement with the administration of Donald Trump. With this, I'm passing the floor to Taras Shevchenko, and I would like to ask you to analyze the situation from this perspective. Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, for the organization of such an expert discussion and for raising the topics which help us to see the broader picture of what is happening in the Russian-Ukrainian war and in broader geopolitical context, which also covers our relations with the US and how the attempts to balance between Washington and Beijing and how they affect our current situation from the perspective of this union of autocracies and axis of evil. So we've mentioned China already because Chinese issue is one of the key ones in this context, considering the fact that, in fact, what is happening between the Russian Federation and North Korea is happening from strategic permission of China, because China in this way is doing something they cannot do directly here in this war. I mean, supporting the Russian Federation direct military support. And proxy dictatorships became for Chinese geopolitical strategy something typical. That is North Korea and Iran, through which China not only controls the Middle East, but also destabilizes the situation in around the Red Sea, Yemen Houthis, which are destabilizing the situation in the southern logistical ways, and the trying to actualize the Korean initiative, and China is promoting it. And in 2024, the Russian Federation gave to China the main key points of control over this way, and now Chinese will suggest as a kind of argument for the trade negotiations with the European Union, considering the fact that the southern way is almost twice as smaller, and the logistical expenditures will be lower and lower risk. That is not what we have in the Red Sea. And this factor, of course, affects how the Russian Federation and North Korean cooperation is seen by China. There was a discussion around the fact that on the stage when the agreement was signed between the Russian Federation and North Korea about the strategic cooperation, which included, by the way, the security guarantees, that China will be kind of against it, that China will not like this kind of North Korea and Russia getting closer. But in fact, absolutely clear that it meets strategical interest of China. In this way, they are kind of out of this situation, but at the same time, they are using proxy dictatorship in North Korea, and in fact, we can be talking about Chinese proxy dictatorship in the Russian Federation, considering the fact that China is using the weakness of the Russian Federation and limitation of economical sanctions limitations in order to control it as much as possible, and with the hands of North Korea, with the hands of Putin regime, to implement their national interests. And here, let me make a reference to a famous and quite sensational quote of the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chinese People's Republic, Wang Yi, who said he was commenting the situation in Ukraine, commenting the situation of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. He, on the contrast with the traditional careful rhetorics of the Chinese diplomacy, he said the famous thing that China cannot afford the Russian Federation to lose, because for China it is a matter of, so to say, keeping the focus and the resources of the US in Europe. And that means that they do not want to redistribute funds and resources from Europe to Pacific region. So in this context, both China and Putin's Russia has the reason to prolongate the Russian aggression in Ukraine as long as possible. The reason for this stage, when Putin and his surrounding are showing that they are ready for the agreements, I think that first of all, there are some economical issues of the consequences of the sanctions imposed against the Russian Federation by the U.S. And in Bishkek, the Russian dictator was mentioning that, and he was underlying that separately. And by the way, he made a gesture, and he said that he doesn't understand why these sanctions were imposed. So now, strategically for the Russian Federation, there is a question on how you can prolongate the war in Ukraine and to continue escalation, because that is exactly what Putin and Xi Jinping agreed about in the beginning of September, what Putin visited the event in China, and they were celebrating the anniversary of China. And then they had the agreement between three of them, trilateral agreement. So Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping, and they agreed that the Russian Federation and North Korea will be together working on escalation of the situation not only in Ukraine but in the eastern flank of NATO, because it is quite obvious that the pressure on Europe is exhausting itself, and you have to add some oil to this fire. And that is what is happening. 1 week after Putin returned from Beijing, we can see the air provocations in Baltic countries and in other countries. And in this context, we can say that, in fact, this current negotiation moment is quite temporary, because the Putin's dictatorship and strategic interest of China, they mean that the war against Ukraine has to be continued. It has to be scaled up to the eastern flank of NATO, at least hybrid provocations on this station, of course. At the moment, this pause, most likely Moscow and Pyongyang will use in order to see what is the current situation of their military cooperation, what Mykhailo was talking about. Quite obvious that Northern Korean warehouses are half empty, because lots of things were delivered to the Russian Federation. But North Korean military industrial complex made a breakthrough because of the improved quality, the reactive system, the launchers and ballistic missiles, and these ports will be used for the transfer of technologies for North Korean military industrial complex to increase the scale, and of course to compensate the expenditures of the munition they have delivered to the Russian Federation in the past. And also we can see the intensification of the military cooperation on North Korean servicemen, and so far officially we are not recording them on the battlefield on the temporary occupied territories, because both the Russian Federation and China understand geopolitical consequences, that the citizens of North Korea will appear not somewhere in the Russian Federation on the territory of the admitted territories, but here North Korea and China can say that that is agreement, and who cares where North Korean soldiers on the territory of the Russian Federation are. But as soon as they are on the territory of Ukraine, and it will be recorded by our intelligence and foreign intelligence, that will be the marker, the indicator that these war made another step to escalation, because that is going to be the new geopolitical reality for us, for Europe, and for the US. And at the moment, of course, China is trying to get engaged in these negotiations, in this bargain deal on the peace deal around Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and they try to get something from Trump in this situation. But in my opinion, it's just a pause which will be used to escalate the situation in the future, to activize cooperation between North Korea and the Russian Federation. And now this pause will be used in order to for both parties to understand where are they now and what should they do in order for this cooperation to be closer and to be more efficient, to resolve the task they have both in China, in North Korea, and in the Russian Federation, and for it to be in the framework of the strategic objectives of China, which coordinates this cooperation, and without its coordination, this cooperation would have been impossible. Thank you for the detailed, deep analysis with lots of details, and considering that current stage of negotiations is moving towards the next end, and it will have an impact on the future negotiation track, also the negotiations on the level of the US and China, and North Korean factor can be used in order to destabilize the situation in the future, and we should not expel the possible relocation of North Korean troops on the territory of temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and now this kind of information spread in the Russian Federation, and at the moment it is speculation, but the Russian Federation has no obstacles to do that, and I think that we will not get the strong reaction from the West, considering the fact how Western countries respond to the current dynamics of the offensive actions. But at the same time, we can see the active diplomatic work on the level of different divisions, and special services are the part of it, and the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Russian Federation is contacting the North Korea, and that is the very high level of direct cooperation comparing to the previous periods in relations of these countries, even though they had economical agreements, economical relations, but the Russian Federation was ignoring the existence of North Korea. But now we can see the intensified cooperation in this context, and therefore I'd like to give the floor to Mykhailo Kuzmenko, because we have prepared a small analytical material on who in the Russian Paz is more engaged to this communication, and can we see what tower in Kremlin is responsible for the communication with Pyongyang, for the continuation of the track of bilateral relations, and who maybe is the key in this communication. Thank you very much. Indeed, that is an interesting question. It was very interesting to research it. The mechanisms thanks to which the Kremlin coordinates with their North Korean vis-a-vis, and by studying them in the group of the hybrid threat analysis, we came to conclusion that it is multi-track of cooperation, where we have different divisions, different departments, different people which are coordinating different areas of the cooperation. If we are talking about the general framework, of course, that is a governmental level, and there we can see that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs plays a key role, and Sergei Lavrov, the minister with the linear ministers. Since 2014 till 2022, he was in charge of the cooperation with North Korea, Igor Murulov. He was traveling to Pyongyang. He was participating different formats of cooperation, but in 2022 he was appointed as the ambassador to China, and most probably the coordination function of the Russian Federation with North Korea on the level of the governor was undertaken by Andrei Rudenko, that is the head of the Asian department of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the economical bloc. This process is actively headed by the Ministry of Development of the Far East. It is already it has already initiated a few economical cooperation projects with North Korea, namely projects like modernization of the Regin port and Hasan Regin port railway, and also the Ministry of Economical Development of the Russian Federation is a part of it. And these bodies now have the intergovernmental commission work. And also the other officials of the Russian Federation participated in it. And beside that, an important role plays here the ambassador of the Russian Federation to North Korea, Alexander Matsegora, that is one of the most experienced Russian diplomats in diplomatic corps, and he is constantly in touch with the leadership of the North Korean Democratic Republic. So if we are talking about the military and intelligence, so here we divide military and intelligence. If we are talking about military, then it was later when the Minister of Defense was Sergei Shoigu. Now he has a position in the Russian Federation Security Council. And he continues to be, in fact, the main one when it comes to defense in the Russian Federation with North Korea. He was traveling to North Korea, and he was a person who was in charge of this agreement, military agreement, with North Korea. And of course, when it comes to North Korea, that is Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the State Intelligence Service. In March 2024, he visited Pyongyang in order to have the negotiations with the head of North Korea to coordinate the efforts with external from external impact. So that is how they cool the Western pressure, which they jointly mentioned, of course, intelligence service and the former chief intelligence service department, and they are exchanging the information about the U.S., the movement of the seas and ocean, which is and also the interacting with when it comes to the borders, but that is not so relevant as cooperation of the external intelligence and military intelligence. And not least important is political party cooperation. And here the contacts are conducted namely by the leading political party Единая Россия, but beside that, we have also the communistic political party of the Russian Federation. If we are talking about Единая Россия political party, Dmitry Medvedev, the head of this political party, as well the former president, he paid a visit to North Korea, where he has kind of visited, he met the Labor Party of North Korea. That is a kind of interesting thing because, in fact, that was the meeting of two political leaders. In this way, the meetings of North Korean leaders with South Korean leaders, they can be meeting as the president, but also as the head of their political parties. And besides Medvedev and Единая Россия, we could have seen the KPRF, which historically sympathizes North Korea because of the ideology, and the head of KPRF, Gennady Zyuganov, was sending the letters to North Korea. He was defending their right for self-defense, and he was praising the bravery of North Korean soldiers who were defending the Russian Federation, who were fighting against Ukraine, defending on the side of the Russian Federation. That is how the mechanism of cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea works. Thank you very much, Mykhailo. In fact, I think that considering the fact that the high ambitions of the Russian officials, especially we can mention the project, the construction of the cities in Siberia. Indeed, there is a place for the North Korean constructors because they are well disciplined and cheap. And even if we consider a military-industrial complex of the Russian Federation, we can see that the Russian Federation is trying to change their immigration policy by limiting the access for the migrants from Central Asia, and there is a project how to substitute them, at least in some spheres, especially it is relevant for the military-industrial complex, with the representatives from North Korea. At the moment, despite the fact that these kind of forecasts were also mentioned by Ukrainian intelligence, and they mentioned 40,000 North Korean employees from North Korea. But at the moment, we can see there are the attempts from the Russian Federation to engage Russian citizens, and in Telegram and other social networks. So we can see the post, the advertisement, and the salaries which are paid on these plans, and Ilabuga, which is one of the biggest hubs for Shahed production, drone production. But we cannot see that there are lots of people are hired from North Korea. But of course, this potential remains, and in the future, if the Russian Federation will scale up the production, maybe even in the sphere, they will try to create such threat for Europe. In this case, we cannot exclude that North Korean citizens will be engaged in it. And I think that Kim regime has the reason to be interested in drones, and that will give them the advantage in military component. And that can be the live hack, because the Russian Federation is threatening in this way Europe, and the similar provocations we can see from North Korean with drone technologies. And here, of course, the Russian appearance will be very relevant for North Korea. But at the same time, if we consider the context of the politicians in Eastern Asia, the Chinese component is important because they are hegemon, and when analyzing this situation in the context of our discussion, we were referring to this matter. But let me invite Anton Ganotsky, and let's ask him to give his assessment on how China interprets cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea, and whether we can consider this cooperation as the leverage on European countries, or whether China was the part of this of the establishment of this union, and what are the perspectives of the cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea and the Chinese impact. Greetings. Thank you for the invitation. That is a big honor. Unfortunately, this time I'm online, but I hope that the next time we will meet offline. The topic is very important, and it is always relevant, because cooperation between North Korea and the Russian Federation, it is a threat not only for Ukraine, but also Eastern Asia. And China, in this case, I would say, is a shadow player who we have to be talking about. And I already mentioned that without actual permission from China, this cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea would have not happened. And many people said in the West that China is not satisfied with this cooperation, but nevertheless, this cooperation is a part of the global strategy of Chinese People's Republic to undermine Western democracies and to have their own impact on to have the impact on the world in this way, because we can see that when using DPRK as the industrial hub, which is supporting the Russian Federation, you can conceal your own role in the support of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And moreover, you do not need to spend your own resources. You can give it to North Korea, or you can be just given the money. And one of the facts at the moment, we do not have the facts in our hands, but this opportunity, the fact that they can be using North Korea as a military hub, it's possible. And by the way, we also had it in the history. In Middle East, through North Korea, Chinese weapon was delivered. And by the way, now we can see example on the battlefield, different Chinese artillery system. The Beijing delivered it to Pyongyang back in 50s, 60s. And the fact that in the West, especially in the US, for example, they do not pay attention to the role of China in this situation, and especially it's really bad when you see, by the way, today my colleagues mentioned it, the reaction of South Korea on this situation, and what we observe, the change of rhetorics from pressure on Pyongyang and, for example, Beijing in this case, on when we're talking about cooperation and context with Russian Federation, and we can see that the dynamics is changing. They are looking for compromises to normalize relations. For example, recently, just yesterday, the president of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, stated that they are considering the opportunity of canceling South Korean U.S. exercises to normalize the relations with North Korea. And that is a very bad signal. And Beijing is using that. And this fact, Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, or Yemen Houthis, or Hamas, we can also add it to this scope, using these kind of organizations or terroristic regimes, in fact, that is a step to chaotization of the international system, to weakening, of course, of the U.S., which has to divide the resources between the alliances. And it is the increased threat for Japan and Eastern Asia, Southeastern Asia, considering the fact that in Japan during the last 2 years we can see activization of the missile exercises, missiles testing, and they are namely aimed against Japan. That is a big threat for Japanese government, and Japanese Ministry of Defense has recently developed the documents in the Ministry of Defense, which defined a priority of the cooperations. So that is also the threat for the Philippines and for Taiwan, because at the moment there are lots of theories, for example, in the West, which I support, that China in potential conflict with Taiwan can be using North Korean card as the second front. The split of the American troops to Taiwan, and in this way they can get Taiwan, which China considers to be their territory. And that is quite possible, because now I actively monitor North Korean propaganda, and you can see their short, soft, so to say, messages of revising of the issue of reunion of Korean Peninsula. And at the moment, I can say that in Pyongyang, they are considering their future, considering future attempts to finalize Kim Il-sung work, the grandfather of Kim Jong-il, and that is the threat for the U.S., for South Korea, which is at the moment does not understand the how deep is this threat, and China is going to use it in the future, because both Russian war in Ukraine and the conflict on Korean Peninsula, that is a part of the strategy of the Communist Party of China, which is aimed on destruction of U.S. hegemony, and we have to understand it, which still exists, and even despite all what we can observe now from the American administration. And we now have to be looking for the ways to deliver this message to our South Korean partners. It will be very hard, because considering the fact who is now in Seoul, we have to be discussing it with Japanese, with other Southeast Asian countries, which understand this threat, because not everyone understands that. And we have to be raising this issue that North Korea can be engaged in the war in Europe. That is for the first time in the history. And we have to be raising this issue on the global level more actively, because in my opinion, recently, I think that everyone can agree with me, this issue is a kind of second priority, and nobody remembers about it, and that is a big threat, a big problem, because if you give such opportunity to use and to let this cooperation between authoritarian axis or evil axis, in the future it will lead to global threats. And finally, what I would like to say is that China recently has changed their policy regarding North Korea, and they are legitimizing Kim Jong-un regional legitimization, considering the fact that there are the invitations to Beijing for the military parade. And after that, what we see on the military parade to Pyongyang, we can see there the head of the president from Laos, from Cambodia, the general secretary from Tulam, and we can see that DPRK is returning to regional politics, and that is happening thanks to China, Xi Jinping, and we can see that in fact everything tells us that the RCP, even if they were not the part of the initial processes of the establishment of the close military technical relations between the Russian Federation and North Korea, at the moment they gave their acceptation for all these agreements, which in future led to the results we can observe now, also on the battlefield. Thank you very much, Mr. Anton, for this comment regarding Eastern Asia, and that is a very important question, because recently it was considered that between the RCP and the DPRK, we have quite cold relations, especially after many economical relations were destroyed in 2021, which happened due to COVID isolation. And we can know that lots of measures were undertaken by China, but also North Korea has limited trade, which was actively happening at that time between North Korea and China. And of course, that hurt the economy, but the factor of the Russian war against Ukraine and the need to get support from North Korea has become something that the DPRK was using a lot, and they are going to continue doing that. But at the same time, there is the major dependence from China, and I think that we will witness how Beijing will use North Korean factor to divide West and to dispatch the attention of the Europeans to different battlefields, to the different military theaters, and that will help the Russian Federation. That is what is the most important for us. And with this, I would like to ask the general question. Who would like to answer it? Regarding the approach, maybe you could have suggested or some separate relevant aspects which Ukrainian experts, when communicating with our foreign partners, with expert community of the European countries, what should we be emphasizing in the context of the development of the military cooperation and in other spheres of interaction between Moscow and Pyongyang? Because as Mr. Anton has mentioned, we notice that the interest to this topic is reducing recently, and it is not anymore in Western media. And at the same time, the Russian Federation is legitimizing cooperation with North Korea, and we can see that on the federal level, no one is concealing this kind of cooperation, and North Korean regime now, in fact, officially admits that North Korean troops participated in the Russian war in Ukraine, and leader of the regime has visited the memorial complexes, a meeting of Kim Jong-un with the families of the fallen North Korean troops. So we can see that this union is alive, is institutionalized, and no response from the West, because that is my personal assessment. They are interpreting this situation as something that is against it. Is it a mistake, and how can we make this question more relevant in the expert community, in the informational community of the Western countries, please? Who would like to answer that? Thank you. Let me maybe start. So let me express my personal opinion, which follows what I was saying before. Pyongyang-Moscow axis is a part of the broader picture, and I think that that has to be the grounds for our communication, which has to underline that, in fact, we are dealing now with global hybrid conflict, which includes also the war in Ukraine, what is happening in Asian Pacific region, and what is also happening around Venezuela. Putin's friend Maduro, who in many cases was supporting to do what Moscow needs, especially when it comes and also American internal policy, because all of his previous statements about Hayana and all of these threats of escalation and the beginning of the regional conflict in Latin America, they automatically were the part of the migration policy in the U.S. Because when the activization of the military combat actions will take place in Latin America, these people, they will not stay there. They will be the hybrid threat for the southern borders of the U.S., and that is Trump's issue. And the fact that Trump's administration are distracted by Venezuela, that is also the part of this general picture. And in this communication, I think we need to underline this relation, that we should not, from the strategic perspective, we should not be considering them as separate cases. The Russian war in Ukraine, Venezuela situation, the Asia-Pacific situation, Middle East situation, because 7th of October 2022 Hamas attack is the copy-paste of the hybrid operations which the Russians implemented in February 2022 in Ukraine, in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and so-called Donbass. So all of these things are interrelated, and the longer these things are in the consciousness of the expert community and the people who are making the decisions and when they are fragmented and the West follow the principle, we are not working with all crises, we are doing what is closer for us, so, and what is further for us does not affect us, we don't care about it. And we have to be trying to, so to say, to make this general picture of these relations, and in this way we can build our communication on the expert level. Thank you. Let me add as well, the problem is that the grounds of countering this access, because we are talking about what is West, in fact. Do we have any kind of collective West? West was based on the U.S. and the unions which were built under the U.S. And when the Russian aggression in Ukraine started, Joe Biden made really lots of things, and that is something that he really managed. He united Western Europe and Asia, alliance and democracies in Europe, in Asia, in some coalition, in this or the other form, in order for this fragmented approach to be unified. So we've seen this step, and therefore on three NATO summits, we've seen 4 leading democracies, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. They not only participated, they enhanced their cooperation with NATO in cybersecurity. South Korea started to provide intelligence, or in North Korea, technological sphere. And what is most important, even despite the fact that they were not able to provide direct support to Ukraine, they were doing that through foundations, through different ways, through NATO. And when Donald Trump came to power, he did everything possible to destroy this trust. And now we are in a situation when alliance on different shores of on different shores, they are swinging from different parts, from different sides, and they're afraid to sink. We can be explaining in South Korea that North Korea is dangerous, but South Korea doesn't want to see that in order not to have this kind of conflict there. And then we have a very obvious conflict between between China and Japan. When China is making a pressure on her about what she said in Parliament, and she said something related about the security of Japan. Xi Jinping is calling Donald Trump, and he's resolving all these issues. And then Donald Trump calls her to calm her down. So instead of getting support, and this support has to be so strong that Japan has to understand that whatever happens in the region, the U.S. will stand for her. And when the situation looks absolutely unclear, especially when the U.S. is abandoning or closing and opening the doors in the conflicts in Europe, where the U.S. alliance are, therefore everyone is thinking on how to build their own lives under the new reality. And therefore, unfortunately, we can be explaining. For example, I'm writing and I'm saying that in case Putin will have conflict with NATO, everyone is talking about South Korea military industrial complex, which is now developing, and they are building the FPV drone plant. They are developing this cooperation, but no one is thinking about it, because, and also in Europe, and they are trying to avoid this conflict. They want to have peace. They want to make aggressor peaceful. So you see, unfortunately, we have 2 issues. Either everyone will postpone this conflict, or we will have very serious conflicts in different parts of the world. And unfortunately, many Western countries will not be ready for it, because they were trying to turn a blind eye on the situation when they had to get prepared. Maybe Ms. Anton will have some remarks regarding this topic. Also taking account that you are one of the authors of the Pyongyang Truth about regional policy, maybe in this aspect, how social networks can be the part of this process, considering that Ukraine is limited financially on the diplomatic level in order to have an impact on this situation in Western countries, for them to get more engaged in countering and developing in countering such authoritarian acts against Ukraine and the other Western countries. So, in your opinion, what is the role of social networks in this process? And is it possible through activization of the interest on the social level to have an impact on the decision of the politicians? Yes, absolutely. Social networks can be used as a tool of delivery of the important narratives for the societies where we want to promote these narratives. But once again, it depends on resources, capability, and so on and so forth. So whether we are able to do that, well, in fact, if we find the right people and if we develop the good strategy, for example, to use some certain platforms, so for example, to deliver the position of Ukraine or Ukrainian opinion on some problems, events, and to connect it, for example, the problems of these countries, South Korea or Western countries, with what you can see here. So North Korea participates the war in Ukraine, and what does it mean? That they are preparing to have war with you, but using different platforms for delivering our position and our understanding and real fact, truth, because at the moment, both in the West and in Southeast Asia, in the countries, I do not like this definition, but I will use it maybe for you to understand, so-called global South, there is a strong Russian propaganda, and we have to, on the level of society in southeastern countries, so the narratives about Russian war against Ukraine are spreading, and we have to be countering it not only on the state level. By the way, we are lacking here resources as well, but also on the public level, on the social level, on for example, we have to be using social networks as well. And the moment I can see there are lots of, for example, there is a Liberal Democratic League of Ukraine, very respectful organization, which is working with communities, with society of Southeastern Asia, and they are trying to deliver our perception. And if we have more NGOs there, the people who will be working on the informational field, they will be delivering our position there. Of course, it will change the situation, not drastically, because in my opinion, in order to destroy Russian messages about Ukraine, Russian myths about Ukraine in southeastern Asia, you have to spend 10-15 years on that. But at least we have to try to prepare these kind of grounds in order to, so to say, to get to this media platform of the, for example, South Korea or at least Japan. So I'm not even talking about defense, because of course we have to be working with them, and we already have some activities in place, and that is something we have to be seeing. And for the people to understand on the level of society that, for example, the support for Ukraine from South Korea is not the stop to the war on Korean Peninsula, because many of my friends from South Korea say that many South Korean citizens say that Im Suk-yeol, former president of South Korea, if the government will be more engaged in Russian war in Ukraine and they will support Ukraine, that will bring back the war. And for a majority of South Korean society, that is a big trigger. And of course it affects social situation and the political situation, and Lee Jae-myung's administration is an example for that. And of course we have to be working on that, and I think that in the future we will have lots of different projects which will at least try to change for us this negative paradigm in the better way. And of course we have to stay optimistic, and we have to understand, and we have to be working on these, because destroying this informational Russian Hydra and Chinese, because China also helps the Russian Federation, especially when it comes to Russian war in Ukraine. Thank you. Indeed, it is important to enhance the presence of Ukrainian presence in media landscape, especially in Southeastern Asia, because when delivering the position of Ukraine, we can debunk lots of myths about the reasons why the Russian Federation started this war, and we can change the impact on these countries, because the Russian Federation, through its propaganda, is now paralyzing the level of the decision level of these countries. And finally, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Mykhailo. Please, what are your comments on this topic? Yes, thank you very much. What I wanted to say regarding whether West understand this. I mean, first of all, the U.S. The threat from the cooperation of the Russian Federation with North Korea. First of thing I would like to say, whatever chaotic the external policy of the U.S. seems now, nevertheless, it is very formalized and very theorized. And if we consider this question from the perspective of theory, and then we come to the theory of unions, so we can see that theoreticians have some certain criteria for bilateral or multilateral relations when these relations can be called union, that is the presence of common strategic interests and mechanisms and many others. And if we look at on the cooperation of Russia-North Korea cooperation through this lens, we can say that it's not union at the moment. So they are moving toward union, but even cooperation of the Russian Federation with China is still not a union, even though they have more indicators of union according to this theory. And therefore, in my personal perspective, is that in the U.S., among the people who are called political class, which is quite often becoming the founder of the ideas, which is later implemented in external policies of the U.S., there is a thought that these cooperation will not become union, will lack time to become union for them to have the joint strategic objectives. Because if we consider this cooperation now, we can see no strategic common objectives. There are some certain tactical objectives, but thinking a few steps ahead, this position is absent in the plan. So maybe the U.S. expects that they can avoid the situation when the Russian Federation will have union with North Korea. And in this case, it will be more difficult to avoid it. Thank you. Thank you very much for good comment, and I think that it can be used as a kind of reference and recap of all the discussion we had here, because we were discussing courtization in international affairs, and this union of Moscow and Pyongyang is an example of how these processes are happening dichotomically in time, because at some certain stage, especially when Moscow was in critical need, we saw the Russian army. So they transferred So when the North Korean warehouses are half empty, now there is a question, what will be next? Because there are no strategic objectives, so they did not develop them yet. And now we are in the situation of unclarity, because cooperation of Moscow and North Korea can be developing can be moving towards development and systematization when servicemen of North Korean will be used in the other theaters and maybe also against Europe in the framework of the hybrid operations, and that is something that we should be expelling. But at the same time, we can see also the process of stagnation and loss of interest of Moscow towards cooperation with North Korea. Of course, if Kremlin will see potential to achieve their objectives both in Ukraine and in relations in the West without referring for their support to North Korea in the strategic places, in the strategic aspects where whether it can be strategic, both when it comes to weapons and in hybrid informational sphere. But anyways, something that stays relevant for us, for the civil society in Ukraine, that is informational work with our partners in the West, and also activization of their interest to this topic, because it is the important topic. And I think that Ukraine Crisis Media Center and the group of hybrid threats, together with our partners, I'd like to thank you for this very fruitful discussion. We will continue this work, and we will communicate with our international partners, journalists will be raising this issue, and in the future we will be engaging them to a broader discussion, to informing them on the current tendencies and what is also relevant for Ukraine, because we have to be debunking myths which exist in the societies of Eastern Asia, and that is an obstacle for cooperation with Ukraine, for opening these markets for Ukrainian products, and I think that is a task for the next years and maybe even decades. So thank you very much. That's it. Unfortunately, our time is over, so follow Ukraine Media Center announcements.